Man saves bear from drowning in glacier. When he gets home, something terrible happens. The distressed grunting echoed across the glacier bay, a sound so out of place in the pristine Arctic silence that research biologist James Kavalik immediately stopped his ice core sampling to locate its source. Through the crystalline air, he spotted the dark shape thrashing in the steel-gray water near the glacier's terminus, where massive chunks of ancient ice calved into the sea with thunderous cracks that could be heard for miles. The young brown bear was perhaps 2 years old, still carrying the gangly proportions of adolescence, but his desperate movements in the frigid water spoke of a creature rapidly losing the battle against hypothermia and exhaustion. James watched from his position on the research vessel's deck as the bear made repeated attempts to haul himself onto the smooth ice shelf that stretched like a frozen highway into the depths of the fjord. Each effort ended in failure, his claws finding no purchase on the polished surface that had been worn smooth by tidal action and the relentless grinding of ice against ice. The bear's powerful shoulders and thick coat, which should have been assets in this harsh environment, now worked against him as the weight of waterlogged fur dragged him down each time he tried to lift his bulk from the unforgiving sea. The temperature of the glacier water hovered just above freezing, cold enough to kill even a creature evolved for Arctic survival if exposure continued for more than a few minutes. James could see the bear's movements becoming less coordinated with each passing moment, the strong swimming strokes of earlier attempts now reduced to weaker paddling as his core temperature dropped and his muscles began to fail him. The animal's breathing had become visible in short puffs of vapor, his mouth open in what appeared to be distress calls that carried across the water with heartbreaking clarity. The circumstances that had led to this crisis were easy to imagine in an environment where climate change had made ice conditions increasingly unpredictable. The bear had likely been crossing what appeared to be solid ice when a section gave way, plunging him into water that would have been shocking even to his cold-adapted physiology. Now he found himself in a trap created by the very forces that were reshaping his Arctic home, surrounded by ice too high and smooth to climb, in water too cold to survive for much longer. James grabbed his emergency equipment, understanding that he was witnessing a death sentence being carried out in slow motion unless immediate action was taken. The bear's attempts to escape were becoming more frantic, but less effective as panic and hypothermia began to cloud whatever survival instincts had kept him afloat this long. His dark eyes, visible even from a distance, held the particular desperation of a creature who understood that his strength was failing but had not yet surrendered to the inevitable. The Arctic wind carried the scent of ice and salt water, along with something else, the distinctive musk of a wild animal in distress. Each failed attempt to reach safety was followed by a brief rest period that grew longer as the bear's energy reserves depleted, until the pauses between efforts stretched into dangerous territory where hypothermia could claim victory over will. "Hold on there, big fellow," James whispered to himself as he prepared for what he knew would be an incredibly dangerous rescue attempt in some of the most unforgiving conditions on Earth. James's preparation for entering the glacier water required the methodical precision of someone who understood that a single mistake would create 2 victims instead of 1 rescue. He secured one end of his climbing rope to the research vessel's stern cleat, then wrapped the other end around his waist in a bowline that would hold under stress but could be released quickly if necessary. The dry suit he pulled over his thermal layers was designed for Arctic research, not rescue operations, but it would provide crucial minutes of protection against water that could kill in less time than it took to drown. The shock of entering the glacier bay was immediate and overwhelming, even through the insulation of his protective gear. The water temperature struck him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and sending involuntary tremors through muscles that suddenly had to work much harder to maintain basic functions. James forced himself to move with deliberate strokes toward the struggling bear, understanding that both their survival now depended on efficiency and the precious minutes before hypothermia began to impair his judgment and coordination. The bear's reaction to his approach was complex and heartbreaking. Exhaustion had dulled the animal's natural fear response, but enough wild instinct remained to make him wary of this strange creature entering his frozen prison. The young bear's dark eyes tracked James's progress with the glazed awareness of an animal operating on the edge of consciousness, his powerful limbs moving in increasingly uncoordinated attempts to maintain position in the water that threatened to claim him. James had anticipated that the most dangerous moment would come when he actually made contact with a panicked predator, but the bear's condition had progressed beyond the point where fight-or-flight responses were possible. Instead, the animal allowed James to approach within arm's reach, his exhausted state overriding millions of years of evolutionary programming that should have warned him away from humans. The bear's breathing was labored and visible in the frigid air, each exhalation a small cloud that spoke of a body working desperately to maintain core temperature. The actual rescue required James to position himself as a living bridge between the bear and the ice shelf, using his own body as a platform that the animal could use to gain enough height to reach the smooth surface that had defeated his earlier attempts. The bear's weight was enormous, easily 300 pounds of muscle and bone and waterlogged fur, but desperation gave the young animal just enough strength to follow James's gentle guidance toward the edge of solid ice. The moment when the bear finally hauled himself onto the glacier was one of mutual exhaustion and shared relief. James remained in the water just long enough to ensure the animal had found stable footing, watching as the bear shook himself vigorously and took several unsteady steps away from the water's edge. The young animal's movements were still sluggish from his ordeal, but the simple act of standing on solid ground seemed to restore some measure of his natural dignity and strength. "There you go, big guy," James whispered through chattering teeth as he began his own struggle to exit the deadly cold water. The bear paused at the sound of his voice, turning to look back at the human who had shared his battle against the glacier's indifferent power, before disappearing into the white wilderness with the quiet grace of a creature returning to the world where he belonged. James's return to the research station should have been a moment of quiet triumph, but the tremors that had begun in his hands during the climb back aboard the vessel were not subsiding as his core temperature slowly returned to normal. What had initially seemed like the natural response to extreme cold exposure continued long after he had changed into dry clothes and consumed the hot coffee that his research partner had pressed into his shaking hands. The fine tremor in his fingers made simple tasks increasingly difficult, and by evening, the involuntary movements had spread to affect his entire left arm. The medical evacuation to Anchorage came 3 days later, when it became clear that James's condition was not improving with rest and re-warming. The helicopter ride south carried him away from the glacier bay where his life had changed in the space of minutes, leaving behind the research project that had brought him to the Arctic and the wildlife populations he had been studying for the past 5 years. The irony was not lost on him that saving one of the region's magnificent creatures might have cost him his ability to continue protecting the rest. The neurologist's diagnosis confirmed what James had already begun to suspect during the long nights when sleep became impossible due to the constant trembling that now affected both hands and occasionally his speech. The prolonged exposure to near-freezing water had caused peripheral nerve damage that would likely prove permanent, a condition that would make the precise work of field research impossible. The hands that had once handled delicate scientific instruments with steady precision now struggled with tasks as simple as writing field notes or operating the equipment that had defined his professional life. The rehabilitation process stretched through months of physical therapy and adaptive training, teaching James to work within the limitations that his compassionate choice had imposed. His colleagues visited when they could, bringing news from the field stations where Arctic research continued without him, updates on animal populations and climate data that he could no longer gather firsthand. The young bear he had saved became part of the folklore of the research community, a story that grew in the telling but whose true cost remained visible in James's trembling hands. "Some things are worth it," James told himself on quiet evenings when the shaking made even reading difficult. The Arctic sunset painted the hospital room walls gold as he watched the news coverage of another successful season of wildlife research, knowing that his sacrifice had purchased one bear's life and perhaps opened a path for others to continue the work he could no longer perform with his own hands.